All right, so we begin international business, chapter 8. This should be, if I remember, international business 16, and we're talking about economic integration or regional economic integration. And section 1 is fairly simple and straightforward intro. All of them begin with a simple introduction. So we gotta say, what is a regional economic integration? It is agreement between governments to lower barriers to trade and to basically, let's see how they say. Oh, to lower barriers of trades, to remove tariffs, non-tariffs, and so on, and to to encourage trade between the countries. So integration is about lowering barriers to trade and lowering movements of goods, capital, and labor. All right, you got the European, you got this, you got that. It's becoming very common. It's becoming very popular. The big example these days is the European Union. The big example of the past is the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was a big political, economic, and all the other types of union. And you got now some Latin American unions. Now you got what's called ASEAN. ASEAN, these 10 countries, we're going to discuss next time in class. So I'm going to go through all of these. Section number 2 are types. So I'm going to be explaining the types of economic integration, and by types we also mean, or we say, levels of integration. You also have a little figure if you want to open page 289. Page 289. And the first one is actually, I'll use red one here because it's a concept. Free trade area. Free trade area. Free trade areas relate to no barriers to goods. All barriers to goods have been removed. Goods move freely between the countries within it. So, free goods and services. This is the first, it's the simplest, it's the easiest. It's the one which countries usually begin with to integrate. That's why we also call it level 1. Simple, easy, straightforward. It's basically the following. We agree no tariffs for all of your goods and services, and no tariffs for my goods and services. I trade with you, you trade with me. We don't impose any tariffs on each other. Now, if you want to go about a level of integration, and complete integration example comes to mind is, of course, the United States. The United States, in between, was all about removing barriers to trade, removing barriers to movement of labor, of capital, and all the other things. So you got in the United States the complete level of integration. Here we just got 2 countries, and they don't impose tariffs on each other, and they allow their goods to move freely between them. They are very, very, very popular. Number two is customs union. Customs union means everything in the free trade area. I trade with you, you trade with me with no tariffs at all. So your goods move freely, my goods move freely, but we jointly will have common tariffs. We jointly will have common external trade policy. Common external trade policy. Let's try to think about it. Let's say we got two countries and you and me trade freely. You and me trade freely. You can bring all of your goods in. I can bring all of my goods to you. But here's the trick. I got 5% tariff and you got 25% tariff, and you're from a country number 3. Are you going to import or export to him, or are you going to export to me? And the answer is, oh, you're going to export to me, and then I will re-export to him. So you're going to export to me, I'm going to pay the 5% tariff, and then I'm going to move in the free trade area the good to him. So he basically gets disadvantaged at the higher rate, and I basically get advantaged at the lower rate. And if you got the lower rate, you're going to be attracting the imports, and then you're going to move them to the other country. So we don't want to do that where I want to lower the tariff here to the third countries, and you will lower the tariff there. So what we'll agree is that we will have the same tariff. We're both going to impose 10% on cars, 7% on food, and whatever. We're going to have exactly the same tariff. So if you want to export, whether you export through me or whether you export through him, you see exactly the same tariff, let's say 12%. There is no benefit to export to me and then move it to him, or to export to him and move it to me. So that's what a customs union mean. Customs union mean that within there are no borders, but outside the border is one and the same. Next one is number 3, common market. Common market. And in a common market, you got free movements of called factors of production. So in a common market, you already have a free trade area. In other words, the two countries already trade freely between each other without any barriers to trade. They are already a customs union, meaning they already have joint tariffs or joint common external trade policy against the rest of the world. But you also have a free movement of factors of production. And I covered the factors of production before. The two ones are labor and capital. And the third one, which does not apply in this particular case because it's physically, logically impossible, is land. You don't have land moving around. Land is where it is. Land doesn't move. But in a common market, you can have workers move freely from Germany to France, and from France to Italy, and from Italy to Germany. And you also have capital moving freely. You can transfer money from Germany to France, from France to Spain, from Spain to Italy. So capital moves freely, and labor moves freely, and also goods and services move freely. And now I gotta close the bracket over here. Next one is number 4. Economic union. And economic union means common economic policy. I don't write it, but it's common economic policy. And here in the book, they also said and common currency. Now, so they're going to have common economic policy. Now, simple question is, what is economic policy? Everyone should know, especially those who study business and economics, but some students don't have business and economics background. Economic policy means, number 1, fiscal policy. And fiscal policy means 2 things: government taxing or government taxation. Sometimes we call it government income, government revenue, and government spending. So, fiscal policy is how the government collects its revenue and where and how and what it spends the money on. The second piece of economic policy is monetary policy. And monetary policy is about money supply, the control of money supply. And money supply is simply quantity of money in circulation. And quantity of money in circulation composes 2 things. The first is called money, as in banknotes. And the second one is bank deposits. And from there we go into banking. That's why business students, finance students, economic students, they study the subject money and banking. And money and banking is the subject about the money supply in the economy. It's the subject about monetary policy. And monetary policy is basically how money supply affects the real economy. Real economy, we mean production of goods and services. So that's monetary policy. In the second hour, I'm going to be talking a lot more about it. And the third piece is regulations or regulatory policy. Regulatory policy. Do you regulate foods? Do you regulate river transportation? Do you regulate banks? Do you regulate mutual funds? Do you regulate whatever? In other words, how you regulate the economy in the different sectors in the economy. So these are here A, B, and C, the 3 primary types of economic policy. Here, these could be hundreds of them. I mean, how do you regulate the labor market? You were watching on the videos and the case studies of Indonesia and Jamaica. What's the government policy on minimum wages? Do they move them very high, like the French do? On the one extreme is French minimum wages are extremely high, and Jamaican minimum salaries are extremely low. Another example of a regulatory policy is labor unions. French government is pro-union and helps union and whatnot. It's against business. German government is mostly pro-labor union. And as you watched in both documentaries, in Indonesia, government is against labor unions. It will not support them. And in Jamaica, the government is against labor unions. What many people missed, some people got very, very well because I was asking about labor unions, but what many people missed was the point is, of course there is no labor union, but the problem is there is no labor union because the government does not support the labor union, does not have good laws about labor unions, because the government sides with business and is against labor, as opposed to France and Germany, okay? Because it's the government's policy not to have labor unions, okay? So yes, it's true, they don't have them labor unions, but the problem is they don't have because the government is at fault here. It's the government on the underlying cause. Because labor unions mostly whatever the government decides. If the government wants strong labor, they will have strong labor. If the government wants weak labor, you will have weak labor. So this is the regulatory policy. All right, so economic union tries to have as common as possible, common fiscal policy, as common as possible monetary policy, or better yet, instead of common monetary policy, you even have common currency. That's the little better case. And they're going to try to have common regulatory policy. And basically that's what the European Union has been working for the last 30 years. For the last 30 or 40 years, they began as a simple free trade area. Then they began as a customs union. Later on, they developed into a common market. Later on, or for the last 15 years, they've been working on the European Union, trying to synchronize fiscal policy, trying to introduce monetary policy, trying to introduce common regulations. That's what the European Union has been working on for the last 10 or 15 years. And that's what Bulgaria has been doing the last 10 or 15 years. What we're doing is we're synchronizing our economic policy and legal framework to be synchronous or to be as close as possible to the European Union, okay? And that's part of the integration. So that's number 4, and number 5 is political union. And political union will have a central apparatus. So it's going to have a central apparatus for common economic, social, and very importantly, foreign policy, especially the foreign policy. Here includes defense and all the other things. And when it comes to political union, I gave you the example of, well, that's what the European Union right now is an economic union. And they're trying to get closer and closer and closer to a complete political union. And complete political union means a loss of sovereignty of the major member states. That's what is the United States today. That's what was the Soviet Union a while ago. And that was historically for Austrians, Germans, the Austro-Hungarian Empire long time ago, many decades ago. So you got especially foreign policy is the same. They're going to have a common military, they're going to have a common defense, they're going to have a lot of things, common social policy, and all the other things. All right, so these are the major types or the major levels. So political union means all of these, free trade and custom and common and economic, and on top of that some foreign policy. All right. Section number 3. And section number 3 is The case 4. The case for regional or regional integration. In other words, why Germany and France will be fighting in world wars, they will be fighting for decades, and later on they'll integrate together. Later on they'll be like brothers, right? You know, Sarkozy and Merkel, they'll be kissing each other and all the other nice things that politicians do. And before that, they'll be shooting and killing each other. All right? So, number 1 is good for growth. Stimulates economic growth. So the answer is a top priority of politicians is overall economic growth and prosperity, and that's one of the better ways to achieve is economic growth, and from there prosperity. Now, prosperity is very unclear word. People, I mean, intuitively understand very well what it means. Prosperity in economics means prosperity is the same as purchasing power of income. In other words, how much you can buy with your salary. If you're just an ordinary nurse or an ordinary teacher or some ordinary fireman, okay, how much you can buy, how many loaves of bread you can buy, or how many mobiles you can buy, or how many cars you can buy, whatever it is, okay? So the purchasing power, so that's economic growth and prosperity. That's number 1. Number 2, I already discussed in FDI, is transfer of let's see what they have here. Transfer of know-how. So you got a transfer of know-how. It's technological. Maybe you can move the camera a little bit to the left, right? No, yeah, like that. So, know-how, technological know-how. You also got marketing and transfer of know-how. Technological, marketing. Managerial. All right. So French are good at wines, okay? Germans are good at beer, all right? So they can learn from each other about it. So transfer of know-how, okay? Let's see. Theoretical, basically this and that. All right, so the case, this is the economic reason. So you have economic arguments. So the economic arguments is economic growth and prosperity and transfer of business skills such as marketing skills, management skills, technological skills. And then you got political. And let's see what kind of political we have. Political cooperation. They actually if you have a political, economic or some other type of union, when you're integrating, it really encourages politicians to get on a regular basis. It really forces them to kiss each other on camera, to take pictures, to smile, to tap each other on the back, and it really encourages them to cooperate. Moreover, there is a pressure to cooperate. Let's say in our more extreme case in Bulgaria, Bulgarians are putting extraordinary pressure on politicians to do whatever it takes that we integrate with Europe. In other words, do we want European domination or do we want Bulgarian domination? And the answer is we prefer European, okay? Because the European is a lot more democratic, a lot more lax and all the other things. We prefer to be run by Europeans rather than being run by Bulgarians. Because Bulgarians are, our politicians are incompetent and corrupt. And if we are run by Bulgarians, we're going to be worse off than if we are run by British, German, French, or some others. We believe this to be true. Now, whether it's true or not is a different story, but we like to be in the European Union, and we put a pressure on our politicians to cooperate with the rest of Europe. So, political cooperation, and you see it happening all the time, especially between Germany and France. I mean, these two decide what's happening, what's not happening, what's working, what's not working, what goes and what doesn't go. Cooperation is crucial, and it encourages political cooperation. Okay. Number two, well, if you have an economic union, there is less likely war. Unlikely. It is very, very, very unlikely that the two countries are going to get at war with each other. They're not just going to go to war. I mean, it's extremely unlikely now that Germany and France are going to go to war, or that Germany and Britain are going to go to war. I mean, they got way too much to lose, okay? There's way too much to lose in terms of business, finance. Question? Let's see, what's the question?
Yeah, I can read it.
Which one? This one? Unlikely. Yeah, my bad spelling. Unlikely war. It's not very likely that Germany is going to go to war with Austria or France or any of the. I mean, right now, Europe, as it is not going to likely to go to war. Each country has way too much to lose if it goes into military and political opposition. And number three, when you are in political union, you got a joint political weight. In other words, Austria is a tiny little insignificant country, and Italy is a relatively insignificant, but you join together Austria and Italy and Germany and France, and now you got a global power that can stand up to the United States if they have to. They can stand up to Russia if they have to. They can stand up to China if they have to. In other words, the European Union is a major geopolitical, again, economic power on a global scale thanks to the Union. Of course, you got to understand that's why the US has been for the last 50 or 100 years the superpower of the world, is because you have 52 or so states that are jointly together in a political union. And each state alone is way too insignificant to affect the world. But you take the 52 jointly together and suddenly they want to rule the world. They want to dominate the world. Okay? They want to impose their foreign policy. They are sending armies. They have armies in how many military bases has the US? About 700 military bases around the world, okay? They still have military bases in Germany, even though they don't need them and there is no threat whatsoever. but they still got the military bases there, okay? Well, they just put in 3 military bases in my home country of Bulgaria. I mean, we don't really need it. I mean, there is no threat. We are part of NATO now, okay? Greece is in NATO, there is no threat to us. Turkey is in NATO, there is no threat to us, all right? Germany is in NATO, everyone around us is in NATO, and there is no threat whatsoever. But they nevertheless put the military bases, 3 military bases in the last 10 or so years in Bulgaria for no good reason. Or actually, for the reason that they are and think themselves as a geopolitical superpower, okay? So, joint political weight is very important. The European Union can stand up to any other political entity, can stand up to the US if it has to, or Russia or China, as I mentioned. So, these are good political reasons. So, the case for integration. And let's see we need to take a break. Let's try and finish here very, very quickly. So, opposition. Let's do this. Opposition. Opposition. Who would oppose integration? Who would oppose integration? So, integration is costly. Integration is not free. When you integrate, there are losers. So, the losers will integrate. So, you're going to have losers. Losers are basically the industries which are not competitive, and this is exactly what you saw in the case of Jamaica. You saw some of the farmers who don't stand a chance to compete against the advanced technological farming of the US, which is heavily subsidized by the US government. So these stand to lose. They have no chance, and therefore they will oppose integration, okay? So that's the one. And the other one, which is part of this one, it's not a separate one, part of this one is it requires painful adjustments. Painful adjustments. I gave you the example of my home country of Bulgaria, where a third, almost half of our agriculture is already bankrupt. These farmers don't have any more farming jobs, so they gotta go to, what was it? Sunny Beach and Golden Sands. In other words, they should go to get tourist jobs, in the tourist services jobs. So they gotta do something else. They are losers. Also, what happens is farming in Bulgaria, necessarily by pressure, is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And smaller farmers can't survive. So smaller farmers can't be farming anymore because they're inefficient. They don't have the tractors, they don't have the land, they don't have the equipment, they don't have whatever is necessary to have a modern day agriculture. So these people will suffer through major painful adjustment. It's a major political problem. So these who will have to make the adjustments and who will suffer will be fighting in opposition to the integration. So that's the case or the impediments to the integration. And the last section is very easy and very quick to explain. So this is 3, the case for, and number 4 is the case against. And the case against needs to explain the concept of trade creation and trade diversion. All right, let's provide examples so that you can understand. Trade diversion is a trade which you did before the union and you stopped it after the union. Two examples will be my home country of Bulgaria. Before we joined the EU, we did an awful lot of trade with Russia, okay? Now we don't do as much trade with Russia because we got common tariffs with Russia. Russians tariff us just like Germans, and we impose on Russians tariffs like Germany imposes on them. So we aren't trading as much with Russia as we did before because of the high tariffs. But we are trading a lot more with Germany because there are no tariffs at all, okay? Another example, which is very easy for you to understand, is before we joined the European Union, you would see in Bulgarian roads many Japanese cars. We got a very, very similar tariff policy on cars, and whether you import it from Japan or from Germany was pretty much the same. So many people will be importing Nissans and Toyotas and Hondas and all of these cars, as well as German cars, but German cars were a little more expensive, okay? Sufficiently more expensive that poor Bulgarians will choose the cheaper Japanese cars. Well, as soon as we entered the European Union, we suddenly imposed high tariffs on Japanese cars, and Bulgarians suddenly stopped buying Japanese cars. They're going to buy cheap French cars. So the trade diversion is no longer trading with Japan, but instead trading with France. In other words, you're not importing from Japan, but you're importing from France and from Germany. And that's the trade creation. The trade creation is the new trade with France and Germany. And this is the trade you don't do with Russia and Japan, okay? Before, we didn't trade a lot with Greece. Now, we got an awful lot of trade creation with Greece. We export hundreds of tons of agricultural produce to Greece, and Greece exports to us a lot of olive oil and olives and oranges and citrus fruits and all the other of their agriculture to us. So we created huge trade with Greece. We're very close. It's very easy to move in and out. But we lost some trade which we had historically with Russia. So that's the trade creation and trade diversion. And now the case against the integration would be in those cases where after the integration, the trade diversion is bigger than the trade creation. In other words, the trade diversion is like a cost. This is the trade that you lose. And the trade creation is like a benefit. Let's try this. Is really good. Benefit. So, the union will have its benefits and it will have its cost, and the union, you will have the case against only when the costs exceed the benefit. And you will have the case for a union if the benefit exceeds the cost. In other words, all that people think is that, oh, if we integrate, it's going to be better. Well, not necessarily. It may be better, but it may be that the trade diversion is so large that the cost may actually be higher. That's unclear. You have to analyze country by country by country. For each country, its benefit with its cost to determine whether integration will be beneficial or not. All right, and this takes care of this section, and we'll take a 10-minute break. All right?